Hello all, today I will be covering Passage 2 out of the Science section of the second ACT test in the official ACT Prep Guide. To start the Science sections, I usually like to just skim through the passage, and then go to the questions and look at what parts of the passage I need to read in more detail. So I will present the passage and the associated figures here. Please pause the video and look over them and read them at your own pace. Alright, so this is about pollination of a particular plant. And we have two associated graphs and one table with information about the groups shown in those graphs. Let's get to the questions. The first question, question 7, says the data that were averaged to produce the results shown in Figure 2 were most likely collected using which of the following pieces of equipment? Now usually in the science section, there's all the information that you need to answer the questions coming from the passage. However, in this one case, there's nothing in the passage to particularly help us. We can go up here and kind of scroll through here and take a look, but it never mentions the types of instruments used to produce these figures. So we have to use our reasoning skills here to try to figure it out. So what are they measuring in Figure 2? We have the groups on the x-axis, and on the y-axis we have the average mass per seed. Okay, so for measuring mass, how would we normally do that? Let's see the options here. We have thermometer, no, you'd measure temperature with that. Telescope, you would look at it like that. pH meter, you would measure the acidity of a certain substance. And it looks like balance is the correct option here. So a balance or a scale is used to measure the average mass that is shown in Figure 2. So here A is the correct answer. Our next question, question 8, says, one of the questions about H. metallica plants that the study was designed to answer was which of the following? So this is kind of a weirdly worded question, but it's asking about what the study was actually aiming to study. So let's scroll up to the description of the study, see if there are any relevant portions of the paragraph here. Alright, it looks like the last sentence here. The following study was conducted to investigate the effects of different pollination treatments on fruit production and seed mass in a population of H. metallica. So here we're looking at different pollination treatments on fruit production and seed mass. Let's scroll down and take a look at the options for question 8. F says, does the location of the plants in the understory of tropical rainforest determine whether the flowers are self-pollinated or cross-pollinated? Well, the purpose of the study isn't really about a difference in the understory or how they're self or cross-pollinated. Let's look at G. Are the percent of flowers that produce fruit and the average mass per seed different when flowers are self-pollinated than when flowers are cross-pollinated? Okay, that sounds pretty promising because it does mention different pollination techniques and it talks about the production of fruit and the average mass per seed. Option H is, how long after the plants are pollinated does the fruit ripen? We don't talk about the fruit ripening up in the study there. And in J, it says, are the flowers normally pollinated by hummingbirds? That's an interesting question, and if you scroll up here it does say, they're pollinated by hummingbirds, but that's not really what the study was looking at. The figures here look at the percent of the flowers that produce fruit and the average mass per seed. Scrolling down and keeping those figures in mind, we see that G is indeed the correct answer because it's looking at the average mass per seed and the flowers that produce fruit. So G is the correct answer. Question 9 says, the pollination treatments received by groups 1 and 2 differed in which of the following ways? The pollen received by each group 1 flower was, then we have a few different options here, and they talk about the group 1 flowers, and then they also talk about the group 2 flowers. So let's go look at the pollination treatments for groups 1 and 2. So these are presented not in either of the figures or in the paragraphs, but in the table here, table 1. So group 1 was self-pollinated, which means that each flower was pollinated with pollen from its removed anthers, and group 2 was cross-pollinated with pollen collected from a single donor of H. metallica plant. So group 1 is self-pollinated, group 2 is cross-pollinated with a single donor. Let's scroll down and look at the options. Let's see, A, group 1 flower was from the same plant as the flower, whereas the pollen received by each group 2 flower was from a different plant than the flower. That sounds promising, that sounds like what the table showed, but let's check the other answers just to be sure. The next option is B, from a different plant than the flower. Well, we know that's not true because group 1 is self-pollinated, which means it was pollinated with the same plant and the same flower. C says collected from one plant, okay, well, it's itself and that's only one plant, whereas the pollen received by each group 2 flower was collected from 6 plants. That's not true because here it says a single donor. Scrolling back down, another option is D, collected from 6 plants for group 1. Well, we know that's not true because it's only collected from one plant, in this case itself. So here A is the correct answer. Note that we could have selected that answer before reading the other ones if we were pretty confident in our interpretation of Table 1. And if you're pressed for time, you should absolutely do that. Question 10 says, for any group, the value shown in Figure 1 was most likely calculated using which of the following expressions? And then we have a few different mathematical expressions. Let's go look at Figure 1 and see what they're showing there. So Figure 1 here has the different groups, and it says the percent of flowers that produced fruit. So the percent is an amount or a ratio of flowers that produced fruit. Let's scroll on down and take a look at the options here. We have the number of seeds over the total seed mass. Well, Figure 1 doesn't have anything to do with the number of seeds or mass. And for that reason, we can cross out F and G because they both deal with the same quantities. H says the number of flowers producing fruit over the total number of flowers times 100 to get it become a percent. That sounds good because we're talking about the flowers producing fruit over the total number of flowers, which if we scroll up, it says the percent of flowers that produced fruit. So here we're looking at all the flowers, and we're looking at the subset of them that did produce fruit. So H looks like a good candidate. Let's check J just to be sure. We have the total number of flowers over the number of flowers producing fruit. Well, that doesn't make sense because the total number of flowers is going to be greater than the number of flowers producing fruit, and then we get a percent greater than 100. So H is the correct answer here because we're looking at the flowers producing fruit over the total number of flowers. Question 11 here says, the anthers were most likely removed from the flowers for the purpose of ensuring that the flowers, then we have a few options here. I don't know about you, but I don't know what anthers are, and after reading this passage, I still need to scroll on up and see what those are talking about. So in the study, we have, before pollination could occur, the anthers, which are the pollen-producing structures, were removed from all these flowers. So the anthers are pollen-producing, and they were removed from the flowers. It doesn't say why they did that, but let's go down and look at the options and see if we can figure out why. To ensure that the flowers would spontaneously self-pollinate, well, if we remove their pollination, then they probably wouldn't self-pollinate, so it's probably not A. B says would not spontaneously self-pollinate, so based on why we crossed out A, it makes sense that B may be right, but let's look at the other ones. Would be pollinated by hummingbirds or would not be pollinated by hummingbirds. If we scroll on up and look again at where the anthers are used, and then also where hummingbirds are mentioned, they have no relation to each other. So let's scroll on down and take a second look here. It looks like B is the correct answer, that they removed the anthers so they would not self-pollinate. Question 12 says, do the results of the study indicate that the nylon bags successfully prevented the normal pollinators from pollinating the H. metallica flowers? So let's see, they're asking about the nylon bags and if they stopped the normal pollinators from pollinating the flowers. So if we scroll on up and look at the study description, we see that the flowers were covered with nylon bags to prevent the normal pollinators from pollinating the flowers. So this means that within these bags and within these flowers, they only had a certain amount of pollinators, and they closed it off with the nylon bags to prevent any external pollinators from coming and pollinating the flowers. So let's examine the table here and see what the pollination treatments were used for the different groups and see how effective the nylon bag was at preventing external pollination. Group 1 is self-pollination. Group 2 is cross-pollination with a certain subset of instructions there. And Group 3 is another cross-pollination. Group 4 is no pollination. So if you have a bunch of flowers and then you bag them up and the goal is to prevent external pollination, then within that bag in Group 4 where you had no pollinators within there should be no pollination. And so we can look at Figure 1 and Figure 2 and see the percent of flowers that produce fruit and the average mass per seed. Checking out Group 4, we see that, alright, so no flowers produce fruit, and therefore the average mass per seed is 0. So it appears that no pollination occurred in Group 4 because the nylon bags were successful at keeping out external pollinators. Let's scroll on down and look at the options here. Option F says yes, only 20% of the flowers receiving the self-pollination treatment produce fruit. Okay, so if you have a bag over the flower but you still have self-pollinators, the flower itself, then having the bag doesn't really affect it because it can always self-pollinate itself within a closed system. So that doesn't make much sense there for F. G says, yes, none of the flowers receiving the no pollination treatment produced fruit. Okay, and that's what we noticed in the graphs up here, that group 4 had no flowers or seed mass. Let's see here. H, no, only 20% of the flowers receiving the self-pollination treatment produce fruit. Well, that directly contradicts F, and once again, that doesn't really mean anything. And J says, no, none of the flowers receiving the no pollination treatment produce fruit. Well, that's true. None of the flowers receiving the no pollination treatment produce fruit, but it's asking if the nylon bags successfully prevented the normal pollinators. And so the answer to that question is yes, because none of the normal external pollinators could pollinate any of the flowers inside of the no pollination treatment. So here, G is the correct answer. Question 13 says, what was the total mass of the seeds produced by the group 3 flowers? Then we have a few options ranging from 0 milligrams to 85 milligrams, or cannot be determined from the given information. So it's asking about the group 3 flowers and the total mass of seeds. Let's scroll up and see what we know. Okay, figure 1 talks about the percent of flowers that produce fruit, whereas figure 2 talks about the average mass per seed. Figure 2 actually deals with mass, so let's look at this in more detail. And we see group 3 here, and we see the average mass per seed is somewhere between 80 and 90 milligrams. However, that's the average mass per seed. We have 400 H. metallica flowers in the study, but that doesn't mean anything because we don't know how many of those produce fruit or the seeds. And so if we look here at group 3, the average mass per seed, we don't have any information about the number of seeds, and therefore we don't have any information about the total mass of all the group 3. So we need to scroll on down and look here. These may make sense for the averaged one. You know, it looked like 85 milligrams was right about where group 3 was for the average mass per seed. However, we have no knowledge about the total mass of the seeds, so here D is the correct answer. Alright, let's recap what we looked at in this science passage. We looked at quite a few things, mostly relating to pollination techniques and classifying them, and then also interpreting figures and tables. Really, the subject matter isn't too important, but as long as you can interpret the figures correctly, that's what matters. The first question had to use some previous knowledge, which in this case was that we would probably weigh the seeds with a balance. These other tools, we wouldn't use those. The rest of the questions you can kind of figure out just from the passage alone. Question 10 here, you needed to understand that when you take a percent, it's usually a ratio of something out of another. And moving on here, you also needed to understand what the nylon bags were for, because it wasn't explicitly mentioned in the passage what they're actually for. But we can deduce that from the results that we see in the figures. I hope this was helpful, and thank you for listening.